your input and interact in the chat. So you don't have to worry though about us sharing your information. We won't be sharing your name. If we share what you share, we won't use your name. So to use the chat though, if you'd like to look down, if you haven't used Zoom before, you can find that the chat is this little balloon cartoon looking thing that we circled in red in the screenshot. And if you want to use that throughout, you may. As I mentioned, we'll be recording the webinar so that it can be viewed later, but we'll stop the recording at the end. Next slide. This webinar is part of a 5-part flood education series that was created as an interagency collaboration with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Pennsylvania Silver Jackets, along with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority, the Allegheny County Conservation District, the Three Rivers Wet Weather Organization, and the Watersheds of South Pittsburgh Organization. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to introduce you to the other 2 speakers that we have today. So Rebecca, if you could introduce yourself, followed by Bill.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Zazis. I'm a watershed educator at the Allegheny County Conservation District.
And hello, everyone. My name is Bill Bradfield. I am the NFIP Program Manager. That's the National Flood Insurance Program Manager at the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency in Harrisburg.
Thank you. And we also have Annie with us today, and she will be monitoring the chat for any questions. So if Annie, you could please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Quinn. I'm the program manager at Three Rivers Wet Weather.
Great. Thank you, Annie. And next slide. So today we're going to be focusing on answering the questions of where has flooding occurred in the past, where is it likely to occur in the future, what information is available to find out where flooding is likely to occur, and what can you do as a homeowner, business owner, or renter to understand and prepare for flood risk. We're going to be providing a resource packet that summarizes all the information that we're going to be showing, which will include a list of the websites and tools that we'll be showing you. Next slide. But before we talk about some of those informational tools, we want to give you an opportunity to share your flooding stories. So we're going to just take a moment to get an idea of how many people in the webinar have experienced flooding. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to run a poll. So you'll be able to answer yes or no if you have experienced flooding. And Annie will share what those results are after the polling is finished.
So we closed question 1, and it looks like about 69% of the attendees here have experienced flooding. So that's more than half. Only 31% said no of the attendees that chose to participate in the poll. So you can see those results there.
Great, thank you. And if you'd also like to share your experience a bit more, if you want to kind of share a little snippet of your flooding experience, please do so in the chat, and we can share those. Again, we won't share your name, and if you'd like to remain anonymous, you can just reply to Annie Quinn. If you look for Annie Quinn's name, you can, when it says "to" down there in the chat, you can just write to Annie, and Annie can share your story. But if you wanted to share, you could. If I were to share, let's say I would say. My flooding experience, I had some basement flooding in my home during a summer storm where we got a lot of water coming in, and so we lost some paper maps and some other paper goods and other things that couldn't really get wet, and that was kind of the extent of it. We were lucky. Yeah, that would kind of be an example of my story. So we're going to give people a couple minutes if they want to share in the chat their story. But no pressure.
We have a story that's popped up about basement flooding from a neighbor moving their downspout, and the flow then hit the hill and then hit their house. So that can be a really common occurrence, as some municipalities are grappling with the idea of telling landowners to disconnect downspouts. And at the same time, we have to be really conscientious of where they're heading, for sure. We also have another story in the chat about a basement being flooded due to backup. And that can be a really dangerous situation, as we know, because when your sewer's backing up, sometimes it's not just water, sometimes it can be sewage. And as a result, that can lead to human health concerns, as well as mold, and the cleanup can just be a really nasty business. We have other individuals who are talking about seeing and witnessing streets and sidewalks being completely flooded. And then we have a request to discuss some of the flooding that's happening in 4 Mile Run. I myself am a resident of the neighborhood above Greenfield. 4 Mile Run is a neighborhood that's located at the base of the rolling hills of Squirrel Hill, Oakland, and Greenfield along the Panther Hollow. And as a result, they are experiencing an incredible amount of flooding that occurs as a result of the overdevelopment and overdevelopment over the course of hundreds of years of houses and parking lots and roads. And 4 Mile Run has very dangerous flash flooding that is putting real human health risks constantly. We have another story popping up in the chat about a township. Let's see. It's located on Big Swickley Creek. We have a couple creeks named Big Swickley Creek and Little Swickley Creek in the region. So that's enough to still remain anonymous, I believe. But in a case where there was more than 2 inches of rain, it's almost guaranteed that that flood will creek. That creek will flood. And it happens along backyards. And then more scarily, it can affect the basements. And in 2004, they had to actually evacuate their residents to higher ground. Situations like those are why flooding is really one of the most severe hazards to our region, for sure. Let me scroll and make sure I didn't miss any of these important lived experiences. Oh, we have one here from earlier, the discussion of how they lived with Hurricane Ivan. It's hard to think about our region having to worry about hurricanes, but because we get a lot of those tails that come off of those hurricanes, it means that sometimes the rain we get here is a very specific and acute an event. And the water from Ivan was, so almost 12 inches from the first floor ceiling. It can be an incredibly dangerous experience and can be a flash flood that can cause a lot of devastation. So I think that's the majority of the stories that I see in the chat. And I really appreciate those who shared. I know that these are traumatic experiences and your lived experiences can be part of very hard stories. So thank you for sharing them with us.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Annie, for sharing those and adding some of your expert regional insights into those flooding stories. If we could also run the next question, which is, did you have any advance warning when those flooding events occurred in your life or in your family's life or your community member's life? It's another yes or no. All you have to do is answer, did you have advance warning? And just like the first question, if you'd like to also share where that information came from, after Annie shares our poll results, we'll be able to hear some of those responses if you want to share where your flooding information came from, like radio or the television or your neighbor or your Facebook page.
So it does look like we had a lot of people who survived a situation that was very scary and without warning. So of the people who replied to the poll, 73% that there was not advance warning for them that that event was to occur. Only 27% said that they had, yes, they had advance warning of the flood. So our results show that there's still a lot of work to be done for sure.
Definitely. Thank you. So we can just go right into question 3 if people are done with responding to question 2. But feel free to respond to question 2 even after we've launched the poll for question 3. So during that flooding event that you have in mind, were you able to do anything to protect your property and the people and pets who lived there? And that's another yes or no poll question. And just like the other ones, after you answer the poll, if you want to share some details in the chat, you're welcome to. I packed a go bag and I got out of my house. I looked up where the evacuation route was, so I was able to get my family out safely, or I put sandbags up to protect my structure, these kind of things.
So it looks as though it's a little closer than our previous polls. So in general, the majority of people were able to do something to protect their people and the pets in their properties. 62% said yes, but 38 said no. And between the two, it's still a pretty tight race in the fact that just like not very many people had advance warning, it seems as though there's still a lot we can do to learn about how to protect our homes.
Yes. Thank you so much, Annie, for sharing those details, and thank you for everybody for sharing your stories. We appreciate it. We can go to the next slide.
We do actually, before you move on, there's a recommendation in the chat about how advance warning can sometimes come from unusual places. And those unusual places can even be your toilet can warn you that it's going to overflow and there's going to be a backflow. And there's a specific sound that it can make called toilet gurgling. So if you want to Google, well, be careful when you Google things, of course, but Google that for a YouTube video. You know, there might even be some warning, and we got that as a recommendation from an attendee here tonight. And then another person let us know that their story for being warned was that their local fire department and EMC alerted them to the flood through social media, especially Facebook. So that is a way in which we've seen the region try to use the tools we have to let people know. So back to you, Mary.
Excellent. That's great. That's good to hear. The more people know about what's going on and the more people that know where to find the information, the more we can tell each other what's happening and maybe try to prepare for these events as much as possible. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so to start our conversation about where flooding occurs, this graphic helps show some of the flooding terms you'll hear today. And if you attended the Watersheds in Flooding webinar last week, you'll probably recognize this graphic. And as we discussed in that webinar, flooding can occur in different parts of the landscape. And it's not always right next to a river or stream. But when we are talking about flooding that occurs next to a river or stream, it is called riverine flooding. And we use the term floodplain to describe the mostly flat area of land that's next to the river or stream. And the floodplain stretches from the banks of the river to the outer edges of the stream or river valley. A floodplain consists of two parts. And the first is the floodway, which is the main channel of the river or stream itself, plus any adjacent areas that frequently flood. And these areas must be kept free of encroachment so that when flooding does occur naturally, it can flow freely without substantial increases in flood heights. Meaning if there was a structure within the floodway, it may cause an obstruction during a flood, which could increase the water surface elevation. Kind of like if you step into your bathtub, the water surface is going to go up. You may have heard of homes or structures being removed from the floodway, and that's why. When you allow a home to stay in the floodway, it can increase the water surface elevation during a flood, not only for that structure, but for all of the other structures nearby. So beyond the floodway is the flood fringe. That's that yellow line. And the flood fringe extends from the outer banks of the floodway over to the valley walls where the floodplain meets the hill slope. And some of you may have heard the term 100-year floodplain. And what does that mean exactly? Well, the 100-year floodplain and its floodplain is the same as the 1% annual exceedance probability, or 1% AEP flood or floodplain. And that means that it's a flood that has a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in a single year. And this is also known as the base flood. And the extent of that 1% AEP floodplain is determined by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. So we're going to talk about FEMA a little bit now. Next slide. And now that we know a bit more about the 1% AEP flood and a riverine floodplain, let's look at how that information is used to determine flood risk for those areas. So FEMA has an online flood map service called the FEMA Flood Map Service Center. And this is the official public source for flood hazard information. And it allows anyone to search for an area of interest and see the location of the 1% AEP or 100-year floodplain. And it's also, if you need an official determination, this is where you would go. You have to use a FEMA map. And there's a couple of ways to access those FEMA flood maps. So we're going to look at those, and I'm going to start first by sharing an example using the FEMA Map Service Center page, the MSC page directly. So by typing in the FEMA Map Services website, I'm directed to the welcome page like you see here. And if anyone wants to follow along in a different internet browser while you're watching the webinar, feel free to do that. Just make sure you don't X out of Zoom. But when I am on this welcome page, I can use this search bar down here with the blue box, and I'm going to type in the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection as an example location, the headquarters, which is 400 Market Street, Harrisburg, PA. And when I do that, next slide, typing in that address in the search will bring up a map that shows the selected location with a little red pin. So that's my DEP office. And the blue line surrounding that area is the FEMA flood map where the little red pin is located. So it's highlighted in blue. And for our location, the MSC directs us to the map 319D. So it's those last 4 digits of that long number up there. So that's kind of the name of the FEMA flood map for this particular one. And if what you need is an official FEMA flood map, and you know that your area of interest is completely located within this FEMA flood map that's highlighted, for example, all you'll need to do is click on this little green arrow where it says download firm panel, and you'll have the option to save a PDF of that FEMA flood map if you need it for an official determination or other purpose. And like it says, the FEMA flood map is called a FIRM. But what is a FIRM? Next slide. So FIRM is a flood insurance rate map, and it's used by state and local governments to determine flood zones. And it's the official flood map for FEMA, and it's means flood insurance rate map, as I may have said already. And for this area in Harrisburg, where we searched, this is the official FIRM for that area. And why do we use FIRMs to determine flood risk? Well, in 1968, the U.S. Congress created the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP, which Bill Bradfield will discuss in more detail shortly. But the intention of the NFIP was to reduce future flood damage and to provide protection for property owners during flooding events through an insurance mechanism that allows a premium to be paid by those with the highest flood risk. So FEMA produced these flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs, based on historic and meteorological and hydraulic data for that area. And the FIRM shows the areas that are subject to flooding, and the flood risk information presented on the FIRMs is organized by flood zones. So I'll talk about those zones in a minute, but for this particular example, you can see that the area in green on this firm is the special flood hazard area, which illustrates the extent of the flood hazard in a flood-prone community like Harrisburg. And to determine this special flood hazard area, FEMA generally conducts engineering studies referred to as flood insurance studies. And using the information gathered in the flood insurance studies, FEMA engineers and cartographers will delineate the special flood hazard area on these firms. And the special flood hazard area is subject to inundation by the 1% AEP flood, so the 100-year flood. And within and outside the special flood hazard area are the different flood zones. Next slide. These flood zones are shown here in a zoomed in image of the firm legend. And zone A and zone E are the flood insurance rate zones that correspond to the 1% AEP floodplain determined in those flood insurance studies. And for both zone A and zone AE, there is a mandatory flood insurance purchase requirement that applies. And also within zone AE is the floodway that we talked about a little bit earlier. So if a floodway has been mapped by FEMA, it's generally within zone AE. And also zone AH and AO, which generally have flood depths of 1 to 3 feet, and zone VE, which is a coastal flood zone. Those could also be floodway zones. But then we also have zone B, C, and X, and these are the flood insurance rate zones that correspond to areas that are outside of the 1% AEP floodplain. So zone X also includes the 0.2% AEP floodplain, which is also known as the 500-year floodplain, if you've heard that. And next slide. So why do all those zones matter? Well, the map that I'm showing you here is known as a FIRMET, and this is the part of the firm map that's a more zoomed in scale. So a FIRMET is based on the firm and the FIS, the flood insurance study. So a map like this could also be used for an official determination if that's what you need. But this map also has a little bit more information than the firm does because it's showing you where those specific flood zones are. So for this example, let's say we're looking at the DEP building again, and you can see in orange is the extent of that 500-year floodplain, that 0.2% AEP floodplain, and the regulatory floodways over here, zone AE and zone AE, and in blue is the zone A. So for our example, our DEP building, we can see like part of it is within that orange zone X 500-year floodplain, but this would not require a mandatory flood insurance premium purchase to be purchased. So that's some good information that you can gather just by looking at this FIRMET and knowing what the different flood zones mean. And so if you did want to download something like this, you could click on the dynamic map tool here, which is one of the icons that are going to be above the map on the MSC page, and it looks like a blue magnifying glass, and that would allow you to download a PDF version of this view of this FIRMET. Or if you needed the whole firm panel, again, you could just use that green arrow icon for the whole firm panel. And then you can also go, maybe this isn't still not what you needed, you can go to show all products. So we can go to the next screen, next slide, thanks. And the show all products will list the effective products. So the effective products are the most current and official data for the area of interest. And you can click on that effective products. You can see there's 70 for this area in Harrisburg. So the effective products that are going to be available. So this is another way to kind of access these flood maps. Next slide. Once I click on effective products, you can see there's 11 firm panels. So maybe your area of interest was more than just that one highlighted firm panel. Maybe it sort of spanned a big area and you needed to find a couple of those. So we can click on firm panels, and for Harrisburg, there's 11 of them. And also want to show you down here this NFHL data at the county level. That's the National Flood Hazard Layer at the county level. So maybe you need GIS data. And so you can get the National Flood Hazard Layer, which has all the information that's in the firms and the FIRMET, and you can bring that into GIS and look at it there. So these are two kind of like really nice pieces of information. There's lots of other information as well. But for now, we're just going to let's look at the firm panels. Let's go to the next slide. And this is that list of the 11 firm panels that are available for the Harrisburg area. And we know we needed 319D. I wrote that down. So I know I needed that one. So I can, again, just click on this download arrow, and that would give me that firm panel. But again, if I needed more than one, I could download as many as I needed. And this is all free information that you can use. So we'll go to the next slide. And as I was mentioning, the National Flood Hazard Layer, you can bring it into GIS if that's what you need, but you can also just use the online mapping tool. And this is a great way to be able to just visualize where is that special flood hazard layer, where is the 1% AEP floodplain. So if you want to be able to just see where your location is in relation to that 1% AEP floodplain, this is where you can do that. And you can access it straight from the MSC page by going to go to NFHL layer viewer, or you can navigate directly using the website. And this can also be used for an official determination. If you found an area that you wanted to make a FIRMET map of, you would select FIRMET under size. And again, you can just you'd be able to download a PDF of that FIRMET map. So just some handy ways to access the FEMA map data. And again, this is what you would use for an official determination. So now that we're a bit more acquainted with FEMA's flood mapping products and some of the terms associated with those, Bill Bradfield is going to show us a flood map tool specific to Pennsylvania.
All right, thank you very much, Mary. Yeah, so I'm excited to kind of unveil this tool. This is a new one, kind of still shiny, that we developed along through a cooperating technical partner grant, a FEMA grant with Penn State University and FEMA. And the whole idea behind this tool was to kind of make a resource for Pennsylvania that pulled together a lot of this different information. Mary just showed a ton of different ways to pull this information from the Map Service Center. There are multiple pages, maps that FEMA puts out. And this is, hopefully, this tool is a one-stop shop to deliver this information. We're going to do a demo in a second. I do want to mention that, all this information does pull from the FEMA database. So if FEMA makes an update at midnight tonight, this application will be updated as well. So it is in conjunction. The important distinction here, and Mary alluded to it a bunch of times because it's important, if you're looking to do a flood zone determination for your property, you always need to go to the FEMA Map Service Center. Even though this is FEMA data, it is not, it's not a FEMA product. So we want to just make sure that, this will get you close, and it's very user-friendly. But, the Map Service Center is the place to go for official determinations. So with that, I will start sharing my screen, and hopefully this will go off without a hitch. It worked earlier today, so okay. So hopefully you're seeing it. Clear out this window real quick.
Looks good.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I was just about to ask for confirmation. So when you go to the app, you'll come with this landing page, and basically it's a bunch of legalese that says, what we just alluded to, that it's a good tool, but you definitely need to use the FEMA site at the bottom of the Map Service Center for any official determination. So you just click and say, okay, that's fine. Before we get into that, I'll just want to point out here that it always defaults to, there's a public view and an expert view. The reason for this is that, we wanted to have a tool that, if you're the average homeowner, business owner, you don't have a ton of floodplain experience, you can come here. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles. It's not super fancy. It just gets you to what you need. If you do have some floodplain management experience, you want to do a little bit more work, we can always click on expert view. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second. But I did want to point out that you'll see when you're in public view, if you come over here to the layers tab, the only layer that you have is the effective flood hazard zones. This is another app that's FEMA changed since last firm. We won't worry about that. But we're only going to look at the flood hazard zones in the public view. So for this, I'm just going to type in, because I happen to know Aetna pretty well out that way, from the community rating system. So there we go. So this looks pretty similar to what Mary just showed on the National Flood Hazard Layer, the Map Service Center. You know, I'll zoom out a little bit just so we can get a little bit bigger picture. But what we're looking at here is the same color schemes. So here is your floodway, so your areas of highest velocity in your zone AE. FEMA still uses the 1% annual chance. So, you know, I know it's confusing. We're talking annual chance, annual exceedance probability, special flood hazard area. So I know it can be convoluted. But here is the floodway. The blue area is the 1% annual chance or 1% annual exceedance probability. That is still a regulatory floodplain. So that would be where mandatory flood insurance is required if you have a federally backed mortgage. And then out here, this is the 0.2% or the 500 year, and so on and so forth. This is what you're going to see in public view. I want to point out that if we click over here on expert view, we start getting a little bit more information. These are the base flood elevations for this zone. So along this line in the floodplain, during the 1% annual chance or the 1% annual exceedance probability, the water surface elevation will be at that elevation across that cross section. I'll also point out over here that, you know, unlike public view, now we have a lot more availability. We have effective flood hazard zones. If we had preliminary maps coming out, we don't in this area, but if FEMA was generating new maps, those would be available. These are our cross section lines. I'll show you the zone A cross sections. The difference between zone A and AE is that, you know, AE have base flood elevations, zone A do not typically. I can click on this, you know, so now we have the firm panel. So we have the actual, you know, flood information map panel number and the effective date. This is a LOMAR letter of map revision. If there's anything that's been done to physically change the map, or under this LOMA, anything that's been done to remove a property from it. If I click on these, I don't know if we have any in this area. Let me just zoom out real quick to see if we can get any to pop up. Yeah, there's one down there. So, you know, so this is a letter of map amendment. So a FEMA determination was made on a property down here. It gives you the effective date and the name. You can go over to the Map Service Center, type in that number, and you can look up what the determination was for that property. So, you know, nice little tool. But, you know, kind of like a one-stop shop. That's really what we were hoping to do with this. The one last thing that I want to point out that we're really happy with this product is, and I saw one earlier over here. Sorry, it's taking a little bit to load. I probably just asked it to do too much. If we go back to public view, and I apologize, come on, work with me. This area is a zone A. I'm not sure if I'm not that as familiar, so maybe you know, maybe you live close by. But as such, it does not have published base flood elevations. And, you know, that can make it challenging for doing anything. You know, if you want to try to elevate or flood proof or do anything to your home, you don't know how high the water is going to get. However, it turns out that FEMA has that data available. It's just not published because it hasn't been through all the, you know, the robust calculations and checks to actually be published. But if I click on expert view, those elevation information that are published that FEMA would put on their maps, those are black, but we also have them. They're called approximate water surface elevations for zone A. So, you know, what I like about this new application is that we actually have this data available for areas that typically you wouldn't see it on the other applications, even on the Map Service Center. FEMA would accept this as best available data if you were to try to do anything in terms of flood proofing, any types of mitigation. So I just wanted to point that out as a nice little powerful piece of information. Finally, and you know, when we go back to the presentation, I'll show you the next slide. One of the things that this app does is if you happen to type in the application or you know where a building is, we're just going to pick randomly, we're going to pick this one right here because it's pretty prominent. When you click on a property, you will actually get information and through a flood risk summary. It gives you the address, the flood information. In this case, it's a zone AE, so it's in the regulatory floodplain, base flood elevation. You know, flooding is from, you know, the main, it's the Allegheny River. In this case, we do have parcel information from, you know, from county GIS. It gets the watershed, you know, approximate ground elevation. There is survey data in here. You know, take it with a grain of salt, but it's there. Gives you county, municipality. The other nice thing over here is that it actually will give you a link to the DFIRM panel. So that'll take you to the actual FEMA site so you can look and make an official determination. But if you click on this risk summary report, and we'll see if this works. If not, we have a slide to show this. Might have to think for a second. Can you all see the flood risk summary?
Yep.
Okay, and this is a good example because since we have parcel data, we actually have the outlines of the parcel there. It's a nice little snapshot. It's an 8.5 by 11 PDF that someone could print out that shows, you know, there's the property, there's the flood zone, and then it just gives a lot of, you know, kind of a snapshot. You know, there's, you know, a lot of the stuff that we saw on the first page with the flood risk summary. It's all there. You know, and the idea behind this is something that a homeowner or business owner could print out. You know, they, you know, were made their way to this site. We're, you know, trying to increase the you know, the awareness of this site as it is relatively new. But, you know, if they take it to their insurance agent or their bank, you know, if they have a question, they could at least print this out and take it with them instead of having to navigate the map service center or some of the more convoluted processes. So yeah, so we're excited about that. So if you have any questions, you know, feel free to play around with this on your own. You know, but it is a pretty neat little tool. So with that, I will stop my sharing. You want to take over, Rebecca, again? Yep, and this was my backup just in case that didn't work. So you know, no need to spend much time on that. But that's you know, that's, you know, the heart of the flood summary report. Another really useful tool that is, you know, relatively new within the last year and a half is Flood Factor. You may have heard about this. Flood Factor was created by the First Street Foundation. It's an organization made up of academics, researchers, a whole bunch of folks who dove into this and said, hey, look, you know, we're looking at the FEMA maps. You know, one of the things that's an issue with the FEMA map is they're static. You know, it takes years, almost, you know, in some cases, almost a decade to get new maps. So by the time, if you get a new map next year, that process may have started 6, 7, 8 years ago. So it could be almost outdated by the time you get it based on, you know, any changes in climate, any changes in development, if you've had a lot of neighborhoods or, you know, strip malls or things put in. And it only looks at riverine flooding as well, you know, or coastal flooding. So the folks at Flood Factor pulled together and said, look, we've got all this information. You know, can we take what we know about the flooding and also incorporate aspects of stormwater flooding and look at climate change and weather pattern changes and overland flow, the things that the FEMA maps don't look, and kind of mash them together into this tool. So, you know, once again, I want to highlight, this is not a regulatory product, but I found this to be extremely useful. And then where I found it to be the most useful is if someone contacts me and says, I need some help. I am getting flooded every time it rains, but I don't have flood insurance. I don't, you know, do I need it? I'll go first. My default, since I do the National Flood Insurance Program, is I look at the FEMA maps and I'll see that they're out. Almost every single time they have been out, when I go to Flood Factor, they are showed to be at an increased risk for flooding for stormwater, overland flow. So you know, this is pretty neat. It is a useful tool. So, you know, we kind of talk about this real quick. Feel free to go play around on your own if you want in this, because there's a lot of great stuff here. We're going to highlight a little bit of it just to mention, you know, how powerful it is. So, you know, as an example for correlation, we use the same address as before. This is DEP headquarters in Harrisburg, 400 Market Street. When we typed it in, this is the landing page. Yeah, Mary, yeah, looking at flooding from many different sources, not just the riverine flooding. We're looking at, we're adding in climate change and storms now, pluvial, what they consider pluvial flooding. So we're here back in Harrisburg at DEP. Right off the bat, gives us a map, gives us an aerial photo, and a score. 7 out of 10. What does that mean? Well, right under the picture, you see that is a severe score. So, we're getting pretty close up there, 7 out of 10. At this point, I also want to mention it's, if you go on realtor.com to look at real estate listings, Realtor and Redfin are two that right now are including both the flood factor and the FEMA flood zone estimated. They don't want to hang their hat on an official determination, so they say estimated FEMA flood zone. But they put that information up front for all the MLS listings, and that's really important. Not only does Pennsylvania have a real estate disclosure law, that if you're in a flood zone, you need to tell people, but it helps awareness because we get too many phone calls of people who go to closing for floods or for a new home, only to find out at closing, one, you're in the flood zone, and two, you're now required to carry flood insurance. That can be, that can deep six a sale, that can add an additional financial burden that people weren't expecting. So we really applaud those, those two real estate web services for including this information to show people what the true risk is. We're not trying to keep people from buying homes, but they need to know what their risk is. So that's my little pitch aside. But I wanted to mention that before we got too far off. So so we land here. So we see that we're at a 7 out of 10 in terms of the severe flood factor. Okay, next slide. This is all on one page, so you would just need to scroll down. So once you get down here, this is kind of what I colloquially call a heat map. It takes a look at all of these properties, and it gives them a score, and then kind of gives a different color shading. You'll see up top, there's a number of all the structures it's looking at, rated from 1 up to 10, from minimal up to extreme. And then you'll also see a bar graph to the right of that. But, from this graphic you're looking at, it does kind of make sense. Along the Susquehanna there, you have your darkest reds. So those are the ones that are most extreme, the most at risk for future flooding. You'll see kind of right in the center of the picture is right where DEP is. So you're in that 5, 6, 7, 8, that major to severe area, and then as you look out to the east a little bit, you'll start get more to the extremes again. So there's an increased flood risk back in there for whatever reason. It turns out there's a small little stream that runs through there that's pretty flashy, and there's a lot of flooding. So this kind of gives you a nice overview of what does it look like in terms of flooding in the immediate area. All right, next slide. Continuing to scroll down that page, there's a nice little graphic. It's just a cutaway, shows a typical one-story, considered a ranch. But what this does is it shows you at different levels of flooding what would be affected. So the default here is 6 inches to 1 foot of water. That's about how high it would look on the first floor of a home. What would be the most affected by this? That's highlighted on the right. So you're looking, obviously, your floors, your carpets, the lower parts of drywall, exposed insulation. Your yard would obviously be inundated; it's underwater. Insulated appliances, would be affected, and most cars may be unable to drive. You'll get some water up into the floorboards. It's not dynamic, but if you're playing around with this, that's not dynamic because that's just a still photo. But if you're playing around with the app, it's dynamic. You can go ahead and click on the other depths. You'll see the water level increase on that graphic right there. And as the water level increases, more of those fields on the right will populate. So, if it gets a little bit higher, 1 to 2 foot range, now you're starting to affect your electrical outlets, your sockets, radiators, 3+ feet. You'll light up the whole entire right-hand side because everything will be affected. Okay, next slide. Last thing we'll show here, this is pretty neat. This is what Flood Factor is basing their score off of. So compiling all of their analytics, all of their data, You'll see at the top, there's, we're at the 1% annual chance, 1% annual exceedance probability. So there's your 100-year floodplain. At this point, you look at where the DEP headquarters is, it is smack dab in the middle of it. If you remember back to where we were looking at with the FEMA firm, just the far eastern corner was in the 0.2% or the 500-year floodplain. So, this data is showing that it is an increased risk. I do have to put the caveat in that we're talking about, the FEMA maps are the regulatory maps in terms of flood insurance, floodplain management. These maps are not used for that, but this is pretty telling that using those analytics, this area is at an even higher risk for flooding than is evident on the FEMA maps. The last thing I'll mention here, you can play around, you can show the, water depths, the 0.2%, 1%, 5%. You can play around with some different flooding intervals to see what the water levels would do, or, how high they're projected to go. Basically, at this point, the capital is the only thing that's pretty much going to stay dry. And at the very top, next, just right of where the flood factor score is, you'll see that it says this year in blue. That's the projected flood risk for 2021. If you click on in 15 years and in 30 years, you will see what the projected flood risk will be. In many cases, it goes up. At the bar graph to the right up top, the red arrow indicates where the flood elevation is in 2021. The little gray bubble that's out by 13 indicates that for the same size event, it will actually be closer to 13 feet. So you'll see almost a 1.5 foot increase in the next 30 years, which is the average mortgage. So it's like I said, a lot of interesting things, a lot of fun tools. Not regulatory in terms of NFIP, but very telling, and it does incorporate climate change, stormwater, overland flow. So a very powerful tool to use in conjunction to the FEMA maps. So, okay. You want me to do the quiz, or are we going to launch the quiz?
Sure.
Yep. Okay. So, quick little poll. Where should you go? You need a flood map for an official determination. See how we did. Don't be shy.
Good news. Everyone was paying close attention. And although they love the new tools that we were able to show because they provide us a different insight and include some climate change aspects, everyone knows they have to go to FEMA to get official documentation. So good news. They all heard you loud and clear.
I only said it like 18 times, right? Thanks, Annie. All right, good job. All right, and with that, we'll move on to the next one, and I will turn it over to Rebecca.
Okay, thanks, Bill. I'm going to briefly touch on home buying or looking for a property to buy or rent or operate a business out of. So now that we've had a background on floodplains and mapping tools, let's talk about using this and other information when looking for a property to buy or rent with greater confidence, including like what Bill just mentioned of not being surprised when closing on a home that it's located in a flood zone and you have to purchase insurance. There are a few things for you to lean in on when buying or renting a property that stays dry, or at least mostly dry. I want to say that before I share the following slides, that if you live on a property or operate a business that gets flooded, then you are in good company. We are in this together, and it is the very reason why all of these agencies and organizations have joined to present this workshop series. For those of you that are not in the market to buy or rent someplace new, you will really benefit from the workshop next week, which will provide information on both larger and smaller actions to reduce flooding, as well as organizations and programs that can help provide assistance. So you can buy or rent a property with more confidence if you learn to look for signs both in person and on maps. Start with looking online with those tools that we just reviewed, FEMA, PA Flood Risk Map, and Flood Factor. And when you have the opportunity to actually visit the property, look around at where the house is positioned on the landscape, such as next to a stream or at the bottom of the hill. And once in the property, look for those telltale signs of the repeated presence of water. So, is the house located in a flood zone? If you're interested in a property, the first thing you can do is plug in the address into an online map like Flood Factor or FEMA's Flood Map service. However, these tools are just that, tools. Online maps may only tell part of the story, but it is still certainly worth your time to look up the address. The maps might be able to show you clear signs right away that you might need to proceed with caution, such as being located close to a stream. As Bill just mentioned, FEMA flood maps are just talking about riverine flooding. And based on PA flood reports over a 25-year time frame, 94% reports are outside of the 100-year floodplain. The 100-year floodplain is relied upon as the factor for whether or not a home is likely to flood. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. There is still a risk to living in a home that floods outside of the floodplain and nowhere near a stream. So it's important to learn more about the other signs that can help you make the right decision. You may remember from our first session last week, the definition of a watershed. Keep this in mind when you are looking at moving into a new place. As a refresher on some important points of watersheds as they relate to buying or renting, water runs downhill and landscapes are connected. When it rains, whether onto pavement, a yard, or a stream, it is trying to find the lowest point. This can mean the water will frequently travel and collect in the same paths and areas. Second, streams are supposed to flood, which is why they have floodplains. If I'm looking to buy a home, which I was very privileged to do as a first-time home buyer just a few months ago, I looked at the geographic position of the house, or in other words, where does the building sit in the landscape? Is it near a stream? Is it sitting at the bottom of a hill or valley where water collects? Is this house surrounded by other houses higher up on a hill? A property that might have any of these traits does not mean certain doom, but you have to be prepared for the potential of managing water in the future. Here's a photo from the Tribune Review highlighting a flood in an Allegheny County community. This is an extreme example of flooding, but it highlights all of the main points of watershed location and stream changes needing stormwater impacts, which we talked about more in depth last week. This community is located at the bottom of a watershed next to a stream that has been straightened with its floodplain removed. Stormwater from the community's upstream and normal precipitation combined with a stream that is not able to handle this type of flow has resulted in severe flooding. Here's an example of a property I looked up in Flood Factor, one of the online resources you can use. This house next to a stream is in the red zone with a note that flood insurance is necessary. Remember, think about the location of the house in the landscape and that it is natural for streams to flood. As Bill mentioned earlier, Realtor.com and Redfin are now incorporating flood factor scores on property listings, so keep that in mind for a built-in tool when looking for properties. Many of us know that you don't have to live next to a stream or at the bottom of a valley to experience a flood-prone basement or worse. In last week's session, you learned about street level flooding, which is flooding that can happen from storm sewers being overwhelmed or roads that aren't able to drain properly. We also live in a very water-rich state, and it is not uncommon to have a property on top of a buried stream or spring. A building may also experience flooding from contributions from neighboring properties. We have changed a lot of green forested areas to buildings and pavement. This is a photo of the view of from my backyard. I bought a home on top of a hill on a relatively flat lot, and the previous owners had to install a French drain and sump pump, and we have to keep a dehumidifier running at all times to keep a mold problem at bay. So although I thought through where my house sits in the watershed, on top of a hill, flat property, nowhere near a stream, there's still basement flooding issues. There are signs of repeated water exposure for you to keep a lookout for when looking for a new place, like basement or foundation cracks, the presence of mold, marshy ground outside, wood rot, water stains, and rusted metal. Take some time to look online at examples to help you learn the signs, and also talk to the people in your life who've encountered these problems firsthand. There's no shortage of stories in our region when it comes to watery basement tales. For those folks that are looking to buy, the seller's disclosure can provide very important information on what you may be up against if you decide to buy a property. This is a snapshot from the seller's disclosure for the house that I bought. You can see here that the seller shared that there were water problems and a French drain and sump pump have been installed. Also important is that the seller was able to provide documentation of the installation to give me proof of when it was installed. I knew that if I bought this house, I will have to deal with these issues moving forward, including doing my best to save extra in case there's a sump pump failure and purchase a backup generator to keep the sump pump in business if the power goes out during a storm. If you want to learn about backup generators, sump pumps, and other ways to protect yourself, your family, and your home, tune in next Tuesday at 6 p.m. for part 3 of this series. The other critical information and resource in the property buying process is the inspection. The inspection will protect and inform you. This is especially important because, unfortunately, the seller is not always honest on the disclosure form, whether on purpose or not. If more than you bargained for is uncovered in the inspection process, then you as the buyer can make the decision to pull out or try to negotiate with the seller to either address the issue or give money back in the form of seller's assist to help you address the issues. Here's a snapshot of the inspection report for my house. You can see the highlighted text is describing exactly those signs that were outlined a few slides back: water stains, mold, and a French drain installation. If you can, devote time to find an inspector with a good reputation, and hopefully you also have a realtor that you can trust who will provide you with the best advice possible, including names of expert inspectors. Thank you. So now I will pass the presentation back on over to Bill.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, so we'll make this a little quicker. I know we're kind of up against time, but I wanted to introduce the NFIP real quick, flood insurance, because if you are experiencing flooding, the NFIP is really flood insurance is the one way to be made whole quickly, not relying on grants or other things to come across. Mary did talk about the NFIP. It was created through the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968. It was really a chance to provide flood insurance at a time when the private industry was getting out of it because there were too many losses. I do want to point out that participation in the NFIP, which I believe every community, every municipality in Allegheny is in good standing. It is mandatory in Pennsylvania, although it's voluntary as a program. But how's that work? Well, by the municipality adopting and enforcing the floodplain regulations, the federal government makes NFIP flood insurance available. What are the benefits of participating? Now, aside from the flood insurance, there are certain grants and loans you are eligible for. Certain types of disaster assistance are made available. And once again, if you have a federally backed mortgage, you are going to be required to carry flood insurance. So, if you're not participating, you cannot get the federally backed mortgage. Next slide. The rules, I'll go over this real quick. Obviously, it's a federal program, so FEMA has oversight. They do the mapping, they come up with the regulations, the standards, and they provide the insurance. My role at the state, where we come in, is we have some oversight, both from the FEMA side and also from the state regulations. We have our own building standards, the building codes that get adopted. We provide the technical assistance, and we also evaluate and document floodplain management activities. We work with the municipalities. We try to identify areas, where things are going well, where they might not, might need to be improved, and then offer that outreach to kind of bring things back into compliance. Next slide. The big one here, though, is that local officials, the local role is the most important in terms of floodplain management. Being a commonwealth, common land use is at the lowest form of government, at the municipal form of government. So it's a local responsibility. So that's where you're going to adopt and enforce the floodplain ordinance, issue and deny development and permits, inspecting that, and looking, making substantial damage determinations after a flooding. The big takeaway here is that there's many different groups, but it all starts at the local municipality. All right, next slide. I realize there's a lot of information here, so I'll just hit the big ones. We tell everyone anywhere, if it can rain, it can flood. It doesn't matter. I was just down in Philadelphia last week where they got 10 inches of rain in a couple hours. No one lived in the floodplain, but they all had water on their first floor. So, if you get too much rain, it's going to flood. So, it can happen to you no matter where you're at. Flood insurance is available to all property owners as long as they participate in the NFIP, of which Allegheny County does. you can buy flood insurance even if your property is not located in the floodplain. And I highlighted that because I heard that a bunch in the last couple of weeks from other areas. If you go and talk to your agent and they say you can't get flood insurance or you don't need flood insurance because you're not in the floodplain, that is 100% false. Let them know that and contact us if you need, because we are working with the Insurance Commission to change that messaging. If you do have a federally backed mortgage, you are required to hold flood insurance. So, one more caveat at the very bottom. Just because you might be out, your lender may still require flood insurance, seeing that you're an increased risk. So, just because you're out does not necessarily mean your lender may not say, hey, you're close enough, you're probably going to need it. So, just be warned of that. Next slide. The last two slides, I just want to do a quick thing. Starting about 2014 or so, we got more, private insurance came into the play. I don't have a lot of visibility on private insurance. It's just that it's private, offered through the insurance companies, whereas NFIP being federal, we have a lot of visibility on it. But I wanted to just kind of compare the two. So you should always, look at them and see, compare them, see if their coverage is aligned. In terms of availability, well, I just said with the NFIP, it's available everywhere as long as you're participating. It might change a little bit, for private coverage. It depends on the policy for private, whereas there's the limits on the right for your building up to 250 for residential, 500,000 for non-residential. Same with the contents, except the values are different. You can get up to 100,000 for residential and 500,000 for non-residential. One nice thing, if you have loss of use or if you have living expenses, if you are out of your home and you have to go, if you're put up in a hotel for a little while, private flood insurance, depending on the policy, can give you money for that, whereas the NFIP typically does not offer that. So there's something to think about. Next slide. In terms of debris removal, always important after a flood. It can vary based on the private flood insurance market, whereas the NFIP does cover debris removal. The wait period, 15 days or less for private, 30 days. It's important to mention that, minus a few exceptions. The NFIP does have a 30-day wait period. That prevents everyone from looking at the radar and saying, wow, it looks like there's a hurricane coming. It's about a week out, and everyone goes out and does a mass purchase of flood insurance just to ensure they're against the potential loss. So they do ask that 30-day wait period to kind of prevent that glut of policy buying just when the radar doesn't look good. One of the big ones here, insurer may cancel a policy under the NFIP. Your premiums won't go up. They will never cancel. Private, they can. You make a claim. You may see a higher premium the next time because you've already made a claim. You're at risk. If it's a significant claim, they may just choose not to insure you anymore because you're too much of a risk. So there's something to think about. And both are accepted by lenders. They changed the regulations last year, so more private insurance can be accepted by mortgage lenders. But the big takeaway from both of these is that if you're looking at flood insurance, which we strongly recommend, if you're outside the floodplain, you can get a pretty inexpensive policy. Look at private, look at NFIP, see which one works. There might be coverages, there's pros and cons to both. Just do your homework and check them both out. Okay, go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much, Bill. That was super helpful. I really enjoy hearing about the NFIP because I think it's really useful information for any homeowner. And I know we went a couple minutes over today. So, I wanted to mention if some of your questions weren't answered today, we do have some more webinars coming up. And next Tuesday and the Tuesday after that and Tuesday after that. Next slide, if you could go to the next slide. So here's those future presentations. If you're wondering about specific things you can do to protect yourself and your family from flooding, you may have some other questions about how to prepare, respond, and recover from flooding. And so we encourage you to go to these other webinars. Today was a lot of information, a lot of useful tools, and stay tuned for those subsequent webinars where you can get even more information on how to prepare, respond, and recover from these floods. So right now we're going to stop the recording. If anyone has any questions, we appreciate you